Okay, so here is Jamie, your answer. Evaluate the case for cutting public expenditure rather than raising taxes as a means of reducing fiscal deficits. So we know it's two-sided. We know that it's about trying to reduce a budget deficit. You've got two options: raising taxes or cutting public expenditure. There is a third option not mentioned, which is actually expansionary policy, as this would help to increase tax revenue and reduce government spending. So we've got a definition here to start with. A fiscal deficit is when the government spends more than the revenue it generates, creating a deficit and a loss on the budget. A little bit longer than necessary, but we've got a definition there. Then austerity as a policy would help reduce the fiscal deficit if the government started cutting public spending. Then if tax revenue stayed the same, then theoretically the deficit should reduce. So we've got an explanation of how that would happen here. However, cutting public spending, so we're then going into the second point, which is kind of an extra paragraph. What is potentially missing from this point is some application. So in terms of government spending, we'd want to refer to examples of capital or current spending in terms of the government spending less on wages in the NHS or reductions in infrastructure spending. Then the next part says, however, cutting public spending could cause a lot of negatives. If the government spending in public areas such as education reduced aggregate demand, this would fall. 8881, this would reduce real GDP and economic growth. With this, incomes would also fall, meaning less tax revenue. Again, a little bit of application here in terms of income tax would be generated, meaning they would stay in a deficit. So just a little bit of clarity on that, or a little bit of specific accuracy. What you would see is that the cut in government spending is going to be less than the fall in government revenue, in which case the negative would increase. Then we've got, and it depends upon how much. So again, another paragraph here. It depends upon how much public expenditure is cut by. A small reduction won't have much of a demand side effect, but a small reduction won't reduce the deficit either. This does look like it's using size as an evaluation, but there are better ways to do cuts to government spending in terms of valuation, and the best one would be to look at it depends upon whether it is capital or current. Now, if it is current, then it would just be AD that would fall, and that may be offset by rises to potentially consumer spending or investment spending. If you look at it in terms of a capital capital spending, what you're looking at is things that would add to long-run aggregate supply, and it would reduce the quantity and quality of factors of production. So in that situation, you'd be seeing that it could become inflationary as well as reducing economic growth. So both of them potentially might reduce economic growth, but there may be a more significant impact from those cuts to capital spending in the long term. Raising taxes would also help reduce the fiscal deficit. Raising taxes would generate more revenue for the government, and with higher revenue, the deficit will reduce ceteris paribus. Again, if we're talking about raising taxes, just some application, e.g. indirect taxes such as VAT, or direct taxes such as corporation tax. However, a rise in taxes depends upon the Laffer curve. At some point, the tax level is at the optimum. An increase in tax level will eventually reduce tax revenues, as shown in point B, where revenue reduces to P1. If they're at point C, then the rise in taxes would increase tax revenue and be beneficial at reducing the deficit. But if at point A or any other point after, then it would not increase the tax load. One little application point could be that it might increase evasion or avoidance. Just to explain why the tax revenue falls to B. But I think that in terms of a evaluation point is very accurate. Depends upon the size of the fiscal deficit for the government. Austerity would be a bad policy if the deficit was only small, as there's a lot of bad domain side effects that would harm the economy. But with a larger deficit, then austerity should be a policy that should be pursued. Raising taxes is more of a safe policy than a deficit, and if they are not stable in other areas like aggregate demand. This feels like a summary of other points rather than a conclusion or a judgment. I think the better way to look at this in terms of a judgment, in terms of potentially equity, but you could also do this from the point of view of public versus private sector. So you could say that potentially in terms of taxes, if it is progressive taxes that are raised for higher income earners, then they have a high marginal propensity to save anyway and a low marginal propensity to consume, so their impact shouldn't be as significant as if you raise taxes on lower income people. So you could say that yes, raise taxes, but only if they are progressive taxes. You could also make the same case for cuts to government spending. So try and cut government spending which affects those on high incomes, or equally across all incomes, and again trying to make it an equity argument. If you were going to justify around public and private sector, you could talk about the types of the types of government spending cuts which may actually lead to opportunities for private sector investment, which may be offset. So you could justify that potentially cuts to government spending may be more effective if you believe that the private sector is more efficient than the government, and that moving assets from the public sector to the private sector might lead to increased investment, not affect jobs, and at the same time solve the deficit.